The Soviet Union suppressed Judaism and Jewish identity for decades. Atheism was enforced by the state. But our guest today, Pinchas Shir, knew there was more to life than the material world. In the era of perestroika, he fled to the United States, and today he's a Messianic Jewish rabbi. We'll hear the story of how he found the Jewish Jesus, and he'll give us some insight into what he's discovered in his academic studies on Jewish literature from the Second Temple era.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. You may know him from the Israel Bible Center. Joining us today on the podcast, all the way from Tiklat David in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Rabbi Pinchas Shir.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, what I hear, we've never met in person, unfortunately, but what I hear is that you have a fascinating story. You've had a fascinating journey toward becoming a Messianic Jewish rabbi and your teaching ministry and your congregational ministry. Where did you get your start in life? Where were you born, and what was it like there?
I was born in Russia, in a nice, warm, tropical place known as Siberia.
Oh, wow.
People hear stories. They're all scary stories most of the time. And yes, it's a cold place. It's also a very huge place. But yes, I was born in former Soviet Union. I do remember communism very well. And that's where I grew up. That's where really my story begins. A big city, and grew up in this big industrial city in the middle of Siberia that used to be not on the maps for a long time because of the strategic importance. And before the onset of satellites and things like that, Russia actually thought that they could hide cities of millions of people. So that's where I grew up. That's where my journey begins. And I left Russia as soon as the doors were opened up during the days of perestroika. Perhaps some of the listeners can remember the days when Yeltsin was on a tank proclaiming freedom and communism is over. Those were the days when the country basically opened up its doors for people to leave. Prior to that, nobody conceived that anybody would want to leave such a wonderful place. So such was the official state line. Nobody would want to leave. Why would we need to open doors? So yes, I left as perestroika began and came to United States in the 90s, did my college here and graduate studies, and basically that's where most of my life has been. So finished high school in Russia, and then I moved to America, and that's where I've been.
Was the experience of growing up Jewish in the Soviet Union, was that different than maybe growing up as a Russian or something else?
Well, it's a radically different experience. I don't know how much people realize or know about what Russian Jewish identity is like. The Russian Jewish experience is very an unusual one. You live in two worlds the whole time. It's not a secret that Russian society, by and large, is anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And yes, most people would hide their identity. They would not talk about it. And it's very common for people to grow up ethnically Jewish and not even realize it. You know, kids coming of age are being told, hey, by the way, we're Jews, but don't tell it to anyone. Things like that. So while most people living in the West, their Jewish experience is all tied up into practice and religion and beliefs and ideals. And so when you grow up in an atheistic society, it's quite a different story. Your own parents don't really believe or follow anything, and they tell everybody else not to believe or follow anything. Why? Because with that comes consequences, serious consequences. And the society really looks down on all religion, but Jews even more so. So why would you want to make trouble for yourself, essentially? And that's why a lot of people kind of lived these incognito lives. Names were changed all the time, routinely, sometimes multiple times over. And people tried to escape who they are, essentially, which is a really sad way to live. But that's just how it was. And so, yeah, I grew up very secular. I didn't really know anything. Communism is what I was taught in school. And so deep inside, I kind of had this understanding that, or this nagging feeling that there's something more to life. When you're being told your entire life that, we're just an evolved ape. And so this is who you are. That's where we come from. And life seems very meaningless if that's how you look at life. I remember growing up as a young man, just asking big questions about life. You know, when you start to grow your own brain, when you start being self-aware, if you want to call it that way, and you start asking these big questions, what is life about? What is the point of all this? What is the meaning of life? Sort of say, I think every human being at some point in life perhaps asked that quintessential question. And so for me, that was high school. That's when I was asking questions like that. And I had no answers. I had absolutely zero answers, and anyone I looked to had no answers as well. All they could give me is just whatever the party line ideas are. And I said, listen, if we're just animals, if we're no different than anybody out there, then, why do I go treat, be nice to my animals to my relatives at the zoo or something like that? It's like, why, if our existence as human beings is just this animalistic cycle of birth and eating and procreating and dying, and that's it, then why struggle? Why fight so hard? Why go to school? Why learn all these things? Get a best job that you can have, and why claw at life and struggle and persevere? Life is hard. Can you just put me out of my misery now? Like a horse that's tired? So, that was kind of a very down way of looking at life. But when I realized that's the answers that I was given. And so deep inside, I had this notion, this feeling that there's so much more to this life. There has to be. There just simply has to be. And I always had a belief that the spiritual world, that there's a whole reality that we don't really understand or comprehend or not in touch with. And I see that all around me because I see all kinds of customs, traditions, superstitions. You can make society non-religious, but you can't really take religion away completely, because people will come up with new religious ideas every single day and create customs and rituals and things that they do based on silly superstitious beliefs that they believe. But you've asked them, why do you do this? And they'll just say, oh, you're supposed to do that. Or when you do this, this happens. And I'm like, that's not very scientific. So, yet that's what you deal with. And so religion persists even in the most silly forms of superstition. So, I searched personally for enlightenment. I looked for secret knowledge, forbidden knowledge, religious ideas. And the harsh reality is that I was surrounded by people who didn't know anything of that sort, and nobody could give me guidance. So my parents couldn't, my peers couldn't. I remember I went to a library and I wanted to read the Bible, and they showed me to a section of books that had a whole bunch of books about the Bible. And I said, where is the Bible? Like, I want to read the original. I want to read the source. And they said, we don't have that. But we have a bunch of books about the Bible. I'm like, okay. And so I started asking around, started asking friends and people I know, do you have the Bible? Do you have the Bible? And nobody would confess to actually having one. So maybe they did, but they just didn't want to tell me. So I just wanted to read the Bible. And I'm like, wow, I feel like such an ignorant person. I can't get a hold of this book that has changed the world. And I can't get away from the fact that it's changed the world because I keep encountering things. I open a book on art and I see Da Vinci's art. I see Michelangelo. I see David statue. And I'm like, where's the story about? I keep hearing about David and Goliath. I want to read the story myself. And sorry, it's in the Bible and we don't have any. I know it sounds absolutely ridiculous. I know, like I don't know.
It's hard to imagine
a fossil or something like that, because this is my childhood. That's how I grew up. I mean, today we live in a world where you really can't put a cap on information. I mean, information is out there and you really cannot restrict information anymore. But I grew up, my childhood was in an era where airwaves could be blocked, where people were literally having jamming stations for radio signals. And Russia was known to jam radio signals because, Voice of America was coming through and things like that. So all the large cities would have jamming stations. There's no internet back then. So press is controlled 100% by the government. That means every newspaper you're going to read is going to be controlled by the government. So every TV channel, government run. There's no satellite communications. That's not allowed. You don't have that. So a lot of times people don't realize is that when people live in a society that's not free, and there are societies still today that are not free like that, you really can be sort of ghettoized from knowledge and information and things like that. And there are people who are always seeking like me and can't find. So my journey's been a long one. And I looked in all the wrong places, and I finally did stumble on the right things. But that was because I met people. Basically, people can say it's a coincidence. I don't consider it. It's a coincidence. I met the right people in the right place at the right time. When my heart, my mind was open, and I was searching and seeking and hungry for truth to know something objective that I can sink my teeth into and realize what this life is really all about. What's the meaning of life, sort of say. I know there's more to this story, but nobody would tell me. So I bumped into people just strangely on a bus, riding a bus one morning. I hear this English coming back from the back of the bus, and I just kind of pushed my way through, introduced myself. I'm like, I hear you guys speaking English. Who are you? What are you doing in my city? And of course they're Americans. They tell me, oh, we're Americans. And I said, so what are you doing here? Are you tourists? I mean, this is a strange place to visit. We're in the middle of Siberia. I mean,
yeah,
they're kind of overdressed big time. They're like wearing these really, really, really big puffy coats at that time, which it wasn't even that cold, but they were coming to Siberia, so they were prepared.
Yeah.
So I said, what are you doing? And they said, well, we came here to tell people about God. And I said, wow, this is amazing. Can you start with me?
Yeah. So
to make the long story short, that turned into a beautiful friendship. Essentially, I, befriended these people. They needed a guide. They needed a person who would communicate for them. And so since I was fluent, I said, sure, I'll help you. I'll help you communicate. In fact, I'll introduce you to some more people who can speak English, and we can all learn together. And, I'd like to be a friend. And so out of that friendship is when I heard the message through American evangelical Christians, sort of say. That was my first exposure to biblical ideas and the gospel and all these kinds of things. And it absolutely blew me away. I can't tell you that I just believed everything right at that moment. It was actually a much slower, longer journey for me.
Yeah.
But what they did do for me is they actually handed me a Bible. The first book they gave me actually was the Book of John.
Yeah.
I remember that, which is, I've realized it's a very evangelical Christian thing to do. Like, here's the Gospel of John, read it.
Yeah.
I read it and I'm like, I have no idea what this thing means. I have so many questions. I can't even begin to understand. It's like I feel like I'm reading the end of the book.
Yeah.
And there's so much more that I'm missing. There's got to be this is like the TV series of 150 episodes, and I'm on the last episode. Like, where's the rest? So I read it. I loved it. I thought it was great because it opened up, all kinds of thoughts to my mind. But I was so confused. So I came back to my friends and I said, you guys have to explain it to me. And I said, all right, we'll have to take it slower. So they actually gave me the Bible and I started reading it. And it took me a long time to really make sense of it, because remember, I was a blank slate, really a blank slate. I mean, grew up under communism, taught atheism all my life and things like that. And so even though I cognitively understood a lot of the things I was reading, on the spiritual level, I was not used to thinking that way. And so it took a lot of patience from my friends to explain all of these different stories, explain ideas and concepts, and share their perspectives of how they understood the text. And that's really what essentially brought me into the fold of being a person of faith.
Wow. So you connected with the gospel before you connected with your Jewish identity and heritage.
Pretty much. Like, I knew who I was, but that didn't really mean anything to me because it didn't really mean anything to anyone around me at all. So it's when I came to the United States is really when I connected with Judaism, if you want to think of it this way. Because if you want to say Jewish identity, is Judaism, then that's really when I encountered Judaism in its true form. Because there are customs and things that we do and kind of ethnic ways of behaving. And that's kind of implicit in the culture. A lot of it, you can chalk it up to a family dynamics or whatever you want to call it. But that's really not anything that's a guiding light per se. These are not transformative ideas that make you truly who you are. You're just mimicking and parroting whatever your heritage is, culture you come from. And so as suppressed as that was, it really didn't mean a lot to me. And I didn't really know what to make of it because anything that I knew about it was actually negative. So, but when I did discover Judaism, and that was here, in the United States, that's when my mind was really changed. I really understood for the first time what I was looking for, what I was missing, and the depth that Jewish tradition has to offer. So that, again, was a big pivotal moment in my life when I had another transformation. Now, first transformation is, okay, believing in God. That's a big step for somebody who grew up in an atheistic society. But embracing Judaism as a path in life, as a way of life, that was another big transformative step for me.
Wow. What happened? How did you encounter the world of Judaism?
Synagogue. I visited around. I exposed myself to the community, and I'm surrounded. So I find myself, when I moved to America, I find myself around, thousands of other Russian Jews who did the same thing I did. Left. Mm-hmm. They left. They couldn't get away from that country fast enough. So I find myself around this diaspora community, and some are religious and some are not religious, and some are a little bit more and some are curious. And so, going to synagogue, being exposed to services, now already having a background of the Bible and understanding a lot of these things, it made sense. I wished I had that in Russia growing up, but I didn't. And so really the version of Judaism that I'm most familiar with is definitely the American Judaism. So, since then, I've traveled a lot and been to a lot of places, and I'm certainly familiar now with different forms of Judaism outside of the United States, but that's what I really got exposed to. And so that's probably what influenced me in a major way.
Yeah. Well, it must have been a super major way because you're a rabbi now. So was it something that was obvious to you right away, or what was the process of figuring out that this was what God had for you?
It's interesting. I kind of wrestled with this most of my life. I mean, I did all sorts of nonprofit work, spiritual work, that early on. I mean, I felt the calling to these things very early on. I mean, look, I went and studied the Bible in college. Why? Because that's what I wanted to study. I'm like, if I'm going to study something, and if I can go to college and I can also study the Bible, why not? So this is it. And that's when I started, in college is when I started doing spiritual work in the community. And I worked actually in the Russian Jewish community. That's what I did. I worked with people just like myself, essentially. Why? Because I could understand them. I knew exactly where they came from. They had the same problems that I had. They had the same warped ideas and thinking about, growing up in a communist society. And so I could understand the struggle that they were having with faith or anything like that. So that's where I worked for a while. And so I worked with different mission organizations for a while, and then did my master's, and then went into really academic work after that. So as soon as I finished my master's, I started teaching college campuses. Bible became my sort of say path to academic career, essentially. Never would have thought that would be something I was doing. I mean, growing up as a kid, I hated school. I certainly did not enjoy it at all. And so here I am, a teacher. I'm going to be teaching school. I'm like, this is weird. Yeah. This was a big turnaround for me. And so I did academic work. And so recently I have been asked to lead a congregation. And so I stepped in. It's not something I planned on, not something I even foreseen. I mean, I've done this kind of work before. I have the training and all these things, but I decided in the midst of my training, let's put it that way, in the middle of my training before ordination or anything like that, I said, yeah, I'm not sure that's what I want to do. I really like academic work. I really do enjoy teaching more than anything. So that's why I went and worked on campuses for years. It's like I spent a dozen years on different college campuses teaching. And so I obviously enjoyed it very much and probably would have continued doing it. But the circumstances turned around, and my own community where I was a member of was in need of a rabbi. And I prayed about it for a long time. It took me months to make that decision. But my wife and I finally decided that this is the right thing for us to do. Why? Because my kids are there, my family's there. And if we're not going to have leadership that's going to move us forward, then, we're really hurting our own family. So I said,
Oh, yeah.
I guess that's me. I'm going to step up. I'm going to fight it for a little while, but I'm going to step up. It's a difficult career. I'll be honest.
Oh, for sure.
It is a difficult career. It has a whole lot of challenges that I can't even begin to describe. Working with people is probably one of the most difficult things in life. College campus, you get new students every semester. They rotate through your class. Some of them come back to another class. You develop a little bit of a relationship with them, perhaps. And that's good. But then they graduate and they're gone, right? So occasionally they come back for a graduate degree, or occasionally they come back, and occasionally I actually see them teaching later on. And so that has happened too. But that's very few. And so people are kind of in and out. And that's a different kind of relationship. But leading a congregation and guiding people, working with families, it's a whole different dynamic. So I'm not sure I wasn't even equipped for that or anything like that, but that's just where I ended up.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Rabbi Hillel said, in a place where there are no men, there be a man.
So yeah, perhaps
that's
a good one to quote. I definitely like that. That could be a very good description for what happened to me.
Yeah. I did several years in ministry and church work, and people are complicated and communities are complicated, and it's like it's sort of like parenting in a way, like where you feel like the stakes are high, and like people's journeys and people's paths, you're impacting them in a personal way, in a real way, where you're, there's a level of accountability that you have, that, not to say that you're not accountable to your students, but there's a different level as a rabbi, and you feel the weight when you're doing it. I get that. I'm happy to sit here in front of a camera and,
there's a certain beauty about that, right?
It's much easier. Yeah, it's much easier. Have someone else reply to all the YouTube comments. And, so I heard from what I consider to be a reliable source, who is, Boaz Michael, who is the director of First Fruits of Zion, who lives out over in Israel, that the Russian Jewish community in Israel seems to have a very different culture, and it seems to be a little more insular than some of the other Jewish communities, and even the Messianic Jewish Russians seem to kind of be doing their own thing. Is that your experience? Is it really like a unique community? Is it kind of an insular community? And what's the state of that community like right now? Maybe in the States or in Israel or whatever you can tell us.
Yeah, I used to be involved much more in the sort of say global Russian Messianic Jewish community. I stepped away from that role a number of years ago when I went heavily into teaching, just because I couldn't combine all the travel that required and so on and so forth. But for the most part, I've had my finger on a pulse of where people are, so I could share a few insights. Russian Jewish community is unique. It is different. Why? Because again, there is there's that bicultural orientation, and Russian culture is a very strong, very definite, very pervasive culture, and that makes us essentially who we are. Makes us driven, perhaps in a different way, a lot of times from others. Adjusts some values There's a certain commonality. I can, because of the former Soviet Union, I get to speak to a Messianic Jewish believer from Uzbekistan, and who would be very, very different. And I get to speak from somebody from Azerbaijan and Siberia out there, just north of China. And they're brought together by a certain common culture that Soviet Union essentially created. And so that makes community a bit more cohesive. And so you will notice that Russian Jews stick together. They stick together in Israel, stick together in Germany. You will see that. They will stick together in America too. So form their own groups, their own associations, and continue to fellowship. So I continue to be a part of that community and speak at different conferences and participate when I'm able. So just something I've been doing for many years. And there's a possibility of creating, sort of say, that cohesion, because we're all tied together primarily through language, but also through a lot of things that Soviet Union has put into us. Let's put it that way.
Is after perestroika, a lot of people left, but is there still a Jewish community in Russia, or is there even like a Messianic Jewish community? Are the people who stayed, and are they free to have that religion now?
There has been a little bit of a renaissance of a Russian Jewish community at large, and that's because there's just a slew of Jewish organizations that have poured resources into Russia, recognizing that not all Jews are going to leave Russia. And there's an opportunity that they had is to basically bring Judaism to Russia.
Nice.
Because there's a little bit of a blank slate there. So what happens to a Russian Jew when he moves to America? Most of them become increasingly more and more materialistic and follow the trend of larger American Jewish society, where Judaism fades into the periphery and it all becomes about acquisition of things and status and fame and whatever you want to call it, the pursuit of life and happiness, right? That's the American dream. So that's what happens. People turn that way. So that would be a problem. Israel has their own issues and challenges. Russian Jews have a hard time being integrated into Israel. There are entire cities and towns where you walk and everything is in Russian.
Really?
Yes. You could speak Russian on the street as much as you could speak Hebrew.
Okay.
And people will answer. Why? Because the likelihood of the person walking down the street is probably 80% that they speak Russian. I mean, there are entire towns like that. What does that tell you? That there's a certain ghettoization. Like, you want to look at the city of Sderot. Just look at the city of Sderot right next to the Gaza and see how many people in Sderot speak Russian. And why are they living there? Because they can't afford an apartment in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
That's the truth. So there's an economic aspect to this, sort of say, hubbing of Russian Jews together, and their lack of integration in society. So some people who came in a much later time, having a hard time learning Hebrew, and so they choose to speak Russian on their daily base activity, and they settle around other Russians. And I remember, I'm in the city of Haifa, and I'm riding the bus, and all I hear is Russian. And I'm like, I feel like I'm in Odessa or something, because it has that same kind of a feel. It has the sea, and it's slightly warmer weather. So I feel like I'm in Odessa, and I'm riding a bus with a bunch of people, and they even have Ukrainian accents going on. So I'm like, okay, that's what I felt like when I was in the middle of Haifa. So what does that tell you? It tells you that people have created their own little world within world, and that does happen with Russian Jews quite a bit.
Is that something that's being carried on through generations? Because a lot of times you'll find second, third generations of immigrant communities will assimilate, but are the Russians still kind of siloed even after, a few decades?
It depends. It really depends. Some societies more so, and some societies less so.
Okay.
I think in America there's a segment that's siloed, and there's a segment that integrated 100%. Same thing in Israel. I mean, there are Russian Jews all over Israel learning, participating in society in so many ways. And besides their name, you couldn't tell they were Russian. So some have integrated completely and 100%. Others you will see walking down the street still speaking Russian and not really not really engaging with the Hebrew language or the culture to which they were transported. And look, the truth is, some left Russia not because they wanted to leave Russia. They left Russia because life was unbearable and everybody else was leaving. And when your whole entire family decides to move, and you look at your children and you say, I want my children to succeed, then you move along with them. And so here you are at the end of life. Are you really going to pick up a new language and learn something new? A lot of times people are like, no, I just want to see my grandkids and that's it.
Yeah. Have your kids and grandkids with that neuroplasticity learn for you and translate for you. Hey, just wanted to take a break from our conversation with Rabbi Shir to remind you that when you like, comment, and subscribe, YouTube is more likely to recommend this video to other people. And the more the channel grows, the bigger a platform we have to proclaim this message and to have more interesting guests like Messianic Jewish rabbis on. So please smash that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Those little steps have a big impact and help us spread the message of the Jewish Jesus and his kingdom to as large an audience as possible. Thanks. I want to talk about your academic work a little bit because that's something that you really enjoyed. It sounds like that was a career that was very fulfilling for you and that you really enjoyed the research. So I want you to take a little time, if you would, and talk about sort of your area of focus and what were your favorite things to study and teach about?
Well, my friends laugh at me all the time because I talk about food a lot. I love food. I love to cook. I love all sorts of food-related things. And so my doctoral research is in meals and food. So I can actually talk to you for hours of anything that is related to dietary and gastronomic issues of all sorts. It really doesn't really matter because I studied so broadly. And particularly ancient food. Like I'm one of those weird people that wants to study ancient food. I want to talk about what people ate 2,000 years ago. Odd, weird, but works really good in the academic world. Why? Because it's so narrow, it's so specialized. And so if you understand how academics work, it's all about that. And certainly that's something I'm always fond of. And I said, I do talk a lot about food or write about food. A lot of my examples come from all the different food and meal studies that I've done over the years. So that's a big area of interest with me. But really the particular sort of say era of interest to me is Second Temple. I am fascinated with an era when Christianity came to be. I am fascinated with the era that where Judaism really developed into what we know as Judaism. Yeah. And so to me, it's such a formative stage. There are so many changes that happen culturally, economically, politically, that I think it shaped us who we are today. And if we understand our origins, if we understand where we come from, whether we talk about specific beliefs or ideas that were developed, or cultural ways or practices, that's usually where it comes from. And if we don't understand the origins, then we're stuck. Then all we have is what we have today, but we can't explain it and we can't rationalize it at all. So I love studying Second Temple period, and anything in that era fascinates me. Obviously, I have my pet areas, but what has opened up my mind a lot, besides reading the Bible, because that was definitely pivotal, but it's encountering a massive amount of extra biblical Jewish literature that most people don't even know exists.
Yeah.
But it's massive. It's just huge, and it's diverse and is so colorful, and the ideas that it expresses sometimes may not be popular today, but they're there. And it's like snapshots in the past. We get to capture what people were thinking back then, what they were feeling back then, and how they understood their faith, their relationship with God and with other people. And to me, that's what ancient Jewish literature is about. I find it beautiful. Like, so it's not canonical, so it's not the Bible, fine, but it's still very deeply spiritual literature that shows the life of the people. And it explains to me actually a lot of what we see in the canonical books. Why? Because they're not a blank slate. They have a foundation. You and I are not products of just canonicity. You and I are people of culture and language and where you come from and where you live and your family, your background, things that you read in the morning color your day. They change your attitude. The YouTube videos you watch color your perspective on life. And so we are influencers, but we are also influenced all the time. And so if we can peek into a world of what you are influenced by, then perhaps we can understand where people are. And biblical authors were influenced just as much as everybody else was influenced. And so I study the Bible and I see their world and I try to understand the world they live in. And the more I can grasp their culture and their world and their everyday and the things that pouring into their lives, the more I can grasp what they actually said.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I mean, we talk about context all the time here at First Church of Zion, and it's just like, you pick up the New Testament. I grew up sort of with my homeschool education, and then some of my college was with a very strict independent fundamental Baptist type of community, and they really they weren't very big on like commentaries. It was very much like this extreme. Anyone should be able to read an English translation of the Bible, and anyone with like an average level intelligence should be able to tell what it means. And as I look back now, knowing that like, what is that? What is this like hubris to say, that we can understand ancient texts just like without doing any work at all? Like they wouldn't believe that about any other ancient text in another language, but like the Bible, it's just like, well, really?
You see, Jacob, there's something about that though. I think it's not entirely bad. Let's put it this way. For the purpose of your spiritual life, for the purpose of your devotional experience with God, right? That is not a bad way to live. Saying, read it, understand it, comprehend it, allow it to change you, wrestle with it on whatever level you're willing to. And so for the benefit of your spiritual growth, being a good person, right? That's a great approach. If you're going to talk about a true understanding, objective knowledge, that's out of the window. So I always try to tell people there's a subjective interpretation of the Bible and there's an objective interpretation of the Bible. Any person is capable of a subjective interpretation of the Bible because they can just say, what I think is this. I read it and this is how I understand it. And the Christian world is full of that, right? Everybody tells you what they think, but that's necessarily not what it actually means. I mean, listen, people can be listening to our dialogue, years from now, and they can say, I think I know what they meant. But the truth is, we are the only people who actually know what we mean. We who are involved in this conversation at this time and place right now. We're the only ones. So context is supreme. Context is king. So, I mean, that's to me, that's the mantra I keep saying. So I have a saying that, I repeat a few times occasionally, and I even have that on my YouTube channel, things like that, that text matters, but the context changes everything.
Yeah. I remember that. Words matter, but the context changes everything. Yeah, you make a good point. I think someone who has no understanding of the time period or the context, reading the Gospels and getting, reading the Sermon on the Mount and seeing that moral standard, that call to repentance, is going to be way better off than someone who doesn't read it. I mean, the translate doesn't matter at that point what English translation you're using. You're getting a lot of it. You're getting the fire hose of righteousness and goodness, and that's good. I'm not saying people shouldn't read the Bible. Everyone should read the Bible.
I know you're not saying that. I mean, everybody knows you're not saying that. I'm just pointing out that even a rudimentary basic reading like that, even misinformed reading of the Bible is actually better. I mean, I just look back at myself many, many years ago before I could understand the depth and complexity, before I picked up Hebrew and Greek and all these languages that now aid me. I was transformed by these things. Truly have been transformed. And so I say, keep doing it, to anyone who is seeking the same idea, because the message will change you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So one thing that I remember encountering as I first got more than like ankle deep into Bible study was these like the 400 silent years, right? Between Malachi and Matthew. At the end of Malachi, everything is looking okay. You got a high priest picked out. You got a son of David there, good candidate for the throne. And then you skip ahead 400 years and everything's different. And the Romans are in charge now, and life's kind of terrible in some ways for the Jewish people. And it's just like, it's too bad that we don't know anything about those 400 years. But as you said, there's a wealth of Jewish literature from the time period, whether it's not canonical, but it's highly informative. If you could, I know this might be a tall order, but can you give our listeners a sense of sort of the flavor of Jewish literature from that time period? What were these people writing about? What was important to them? What did they desire? Like, what were their goals in writing the things that they wrote?
I think they all had different goals. I mean, we have bits and pieces of everything. We just kind of mishmash it all together. But it really is a composite of Jewish life. Obviously, there were some Jews who were living outside of Israel, scattered in places like Alexandria, Egypt, let's put it that way, right? And what is important to them is very different than what's important to another Jew living somewhere else, let's say in Babylon. And so these are vastly different worlds, and they have their own concerns, and so they're working it out. So obviously, living among non-Jews, a lot of the Hellenistic ideas that they've embraced, they're trying to synthesize this with Judaism. Like, what do we know about who we are and what we believe, and how and what parts can we adapt and synthesize? And so things like Philo is a great example. He takes Greek philosophy, he embraces a lot of its ideals, and he blends it with Torah. I mean, Philo knows Torah. He writes about Moses and Torah and commentaries. Like, this is his own commentary on Torah. I know it doesn't sound rabbinic, but he's pre-rabbinic. So what do you want?
Yeah.
He's got very righteous Jewish ideas about Torah and life, yet they're wrapped in a language of philosophy, and that's really foreign to somebody who comes from a shtetl world today. I don't expect an average Hasidic Jew to understand unless they have invested years or years into reading Greek classics. So that's the world of Philo. So that's one flavor of a Jew, right? And another flavor would be somebody living in more Jerusalem life, and they're going to talk about halacha, and they're going to discuss things that matter to them, temple, and these kinds of ideas. And then you also have people like Josephus, aristocrat, living in Rome, writing to the Roman audience in Greek, but being such a fascinating person, also an incredibly learned perspective on Jewish life, reveals all kinds of interesting tidbits of information, but he wraps it all up in a very Roman package as he delivers it, because he's not writing for Jews, and so we read literature like that and we realize how much value it is to us. I mean, besides, outside of Josephus, we know so little history, actually. If he didn't do that for us, where would we be? I mean, like, the entire framework of a lot of historical timelines are built entirely on him. So he did a huge service to us. So the gamut of literature is really all over the place. I mean, you have things like Wisdom of Solomon that talks about proverbial type wisdom, right? It does sound a lot like Proverbs, and you read it and you're like, wait a minute, haven't I read that somewhere before? Yeah. And, Ben Sira, I just did I like Ben Sira. So that's a translation I just did of a book, a fresh retranslation, kind of revamped it and try to make it very intelligible and easier to understand for average 21st century reader. Because sometimes you read these translations and they're like, wow, this is hard. This takes some real thinking to really comprehend what they're saying. So can this be smoothed out? So I did that with Ben Sira. Ben Sira is a beautiful a book of wisdom, really. It really is. It sounds a little bit like the Gospels occasionally, mixed with King Solomon's wisdom, and a little bit of Psalms maybe blended in there. So like it really is an unusual book. And then there's all kinds of apocalyptic, esoteric ideas. Yeah. And that is a whole entire world. So imagine a world of Jewish mysticism, and imagine a world of visions and dreams and interpretations of the visions of dreams. Like, People who read the Bible encounter a little bit of that with Ezekiel and Isaiah. But you delve into the world of Second Temple literature and you have so much more. Book of Enoch was a prime example. And I love Enoch. I write a lot about Enoch. I translated Enoch and all kinds of things. It's just absolutely fascinating. Just making a connection of how much Enoch literature actually has influenced even New Testament and other ideas that Jews have embraced in that time and in that era. So really the gamut of literature is so broad and so diverse. And you have some people who are more concerned with customs and traditions and laws and how do you live life, and other people are more concerned about chasing God in the sky. And what does he look like? What does he want from us? And what are these angels are saying? And how is the end is going to be when God finally comes down and decides to wipe the earth clean? Who's going to be left standing? And what criteria do I apply to my life in order to be one of those people? If that happens,
that would be good to know. Yeah,
and there's all kinds of really diversity of Jewish thought, and people who study New Testament encounter a lot of this diversity through different movements. We have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, we have the Essene ideas floating all over there, and we have Zealot ideas and the Herodian perspective and so on and so forth. We have all these different Jews right there on the pages of the New Testament. Well, all of these ideas come from somewhere, and most of them are expressed in the Second Temple literature in some way, shape, or form. And at least that's where they're born. And then they carried over into the pages of New Testament, even in some peripheral way sometimes.
Yeah. I think I was in high school when I first learned from a commentary that Jude has his ideas about like angels and there's several things in Jude that seem to just drop out of nowhere. It's like, where's that in the Old Testament?
Jude
it's just
quotes First Enoch.
Yeah.
He just quotes it straight out. He just lifts a whole entire chunk out of First Enoch and quotes it. And it's the legend of the angels that have fallen. And so people are fascinated with Nephilim and all that kind of stuff. The internet is full of that kind of stuff. And some of it is, as fascinating as studying the aliens and things like that. But, I study ancient texts. So I look at that stuff, and some of the people come up with these ideas, and I'm like, where in the world did you read that? And the truth is, they didn't. They just made it up, or they had a dream, or who knows? Enoch is very, very influential. So you're absolutely right. It's there.
Yeah. Would you say like what streams of Second Temple Judaism like that already existed? Which ones do you think were most like influential or formative as far as the thoughts and worldviews of the New Testament authors?
I think it's a blend. I think it's a mix. New Testament authors, again, they're just products of their environment. I would say, Pharisaism is definitely probably the most influential stream, because they were the most numerous and the most populous movement. We would expect that. It's like saying, Hollywood does not affect movie industry around the world. I'm sorry, it does. Like American music pretty much sets the trend. Right? Come on. And then there are genres and styles within American music that are going to be more influential. Like pop is going to be more influential than avant-garde jazz, right?
Experimental noise rock.
Culture is culture, and it actually works in patterns. And so when you have a movement that's more populist, when you have a movement that's more influential, it has the big, bright ideas, that's more attractive, that movement is going to have more traction. And Pharisees were that movement. Why? Because they were really passionate about God, if you want to think about it that way. I know a lot of people don't think of Pharisees being passionate for God, but they were the experiencing God people, quintessentially, for the reference to the Christian crown. They were serious about that. They were serious about God and their experience with him, while others were serious about God in a different way. Sadducees were small, elite, but very influential group, because they got to shape politics They got to turn kings and, princes, and all the royal families were absolutely affected by them and their ideology. And they also had quite a bit. And temple, that's in the midst of that. Sadducees run it. They fix it. They orchestrate it. They set it up. And a lot of what they say essentially goes. Even Pharisees would accept a lot of Sadduceic ideals because they're the people who set rules, and you work within the system. You can't just create your own alternative system. I mean, some people have tried that, right? We talk about Qumran. At least the Essene hypothesis is they just created their own little alternative out there. Oh, we're just going to move out to the desert and start a whole new different society. We're going to live differently. We're going to have better laws, and we're going to worship God better than everybody else, and so on and so forth. So yes, there are sects within Judaism that are definitely influential. I'll say Pharisaic, definitely very influential. Sadducees, by the very fact that they just create structure that everybody follows. Whether you like it or not, you come in to worship in the Sadduceic temple, and they make the rules, and they set the calendar. They organize the dates, and they decide what sacrifices happen when. You don't like it? Too bad. Either you go along with it, or you move out to the desert and be one of those guys. And some people have done that. So Qumran is a fascinating community in itself. How much influence it had on the greater Jewish society, I'm not quite sure, but the Essene hypothesis has changed quite a bit in the recent years. There's been more ideas coming out of that, and I like that. I like the fact that we're not stagnant, that people are rethinking some of the discoveries that have been made in the past years, and as translations are being published, people are rethinking and where these texts come from, what do they mean, why are they there, and who are these people living at the foot of those caves, essentially. So that's a lot of change in there.
As you talk about the different communities, like the different groups you could point to and define, I wonder if because I feel like as I've looked at all of this, I got the sense that there is at least some subsection of academia that would point to the Qumran community as being, as far as having the apocalyptic edge and urgency of like the finality of the age and its imminence that you do find throughout the New Testament, that of all the Jewish groups that were extant, at the time, the Qumran community seems to be the other group that talks that way. You don't find that kind of language as much coming from anywhere else. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I'm not sure that's accurate. And the truth is, we don't find other documents coming from anywhere else. We have nothing to compare it with. We can say Qumranites were very apocalyptically focused Jews. And that's fine. That's because we found their library. Yeah. Did you find another library somewhere else to compare it with?
Yeah.
No, you didn't. So that's an assumption, essentially.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say there was a segment of Jewish population that was very apocalyptically minded. And apocalyptical thinking at large, in my understanding, is a reaction. It's a reaction to a very harsh reality of life. It's a reaction to persecution, subjugation, really being not free in your own country. And so whether you're in diaspora and you're thinking these apocalyptic thoughts, God needs to come down and punish all these infidels, right? Or you are living in Jerusalem and saying, I can't walk in my own city and do what I want because these crazy Romans came in and they're ruling everybody and they're telling everybody what to do. And the high priest answers to them, and whatever they say, he does, because if he doesn't, they put him out and put somebody else into his place. And so all of a sudden you realize the whole system is rigged, and you're saying God needs to come down and strike all these sinners dead. So you're going to have apocalyptic thinking Jews living pretty much anywhere. Why? Because it is a reaction to a harsh reality, things that you see that's wrong and injustices, and you say, we can't fix it. We tried to fix it. We failed fixing it. And half of the people I'm looking around not even interested in fixing it anyway. So we need a big do-over. So please come, God, wipe the slate clean. And so there's going to be apocalyptically thinking Jews pretty much anywhere. And I don't think it's fair to say the Qumran that they were more so or less so. I mean, what we have documents. But if we had just as many documents found in other places, we probably would have found that there were people expressing the same kind of beliefs and ideas everywhere else. It's just that we have a treasure in Qumran, and we don't have that from other places. And we're not even sure if Qumran Jews actually wrote those documents. So the biggest thing in rethinking the Essene hypothesis, let's put it that way, is that we have a library and we have a community, a settlement at the foot of these rocks, right?
Yeah.
And we assume that they're the ones who wrote it. But did they? We don't know that. We actually don't have truly the evidence. And so a lot of scholars are now proposing the idea that the scrolls were brought to the caves from Jerusalem and hidden there. Why? Because they feared that they would be destroyed, because they feared the coming destruction. And so they were put there for safekeeping, and whoever put them for their safekeeping simply did not come back. They didn't survive. They didn't make it. And so did the people living in the Qumran settlement actually write those things? Maybe. Maybe they did. Maybe they did some. Maybe there was a connection between the people who brought the scrolls and the people who lived at the foot of those mountains, right? So we don't really know because we have so little evidence. All we have is texts and ancient stuff we found, little tiny remnants of life, like, people's hair combs or personal effects and writing implements and things like that. And we assume people have built out this whole idea of a scriptorium, that there was a scriptorium Qumran. I'm like, I don't see the evidence for that. I just don't. I don't see an army of scribes copying these scrolls. Did some of it happen? Yeah, it happened. And we have more questions than answers. That's the truth, Jacob. And so we keep rethinking these ideas, because you have to realize that people who found the scrolls and people who translated the scrolls and people who kind of gatekept all of that research early on, where they came from. Look at the backgrounds, theological and cultural backgrounds of the people who researched that stuff. And you will find out that the reason why the composite sketch of Essenes looks the way it does is because the world that they come from, they know monks. So they said, Essenes must have been just like us. They were a bunch of monks sitting together, writing scrolls, copying these books. And so that, look, they don't have any women. Let's talk about that for next 40 years. So things like that. So, I'm like, that's not a fundamental Jewish value to have no women. I'm like, how many Jewish... how many Jewish orders do you know today? How many Jewish religious groups do you know today that say, we forswear women, no children for us? It's like, it's silly. I make fun of it. I laugh at it because I'm like, the first commandment of the Bible, right? Come on.
Yeah, man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife.
And we're like, okay, we're going to forgo that. As hardline as the scenes were about stuff, I have a hard time believing that they would forego that. I mean, they were serious about God. They really were. Look at how, if they truly believed in purity the way that we think they did, with the amount of mikvahot that are found there, with elaborate ideas of purifications, multiple times a day. If that's how they believed about that, just think about other commandments that they would have taken just as seriously. So again, just because we don't have information about it, just because some scrap of parchment didn't survive to tell us the story, it doesn't mean that didn't happen. And so we have these little incomplete views, and we have our theories, and we have our hypotheses, and we put them forward, and they stand until somebody else comes and challenges that idea. So that's where we are right now with Qumran and Essenes. I mean, I love comparing those scrolls and looking at the documents. The Damascus document is fascinating. I love comparing it to the New Testament and seeing the connections and parallels, but people have been doing it for a long time. So,
So if someone's out there listening and they're thinking, well, okay, what if I were to read one or two of these texts, these intertestamental texts, which ones sort of give the most the most value for time as far as, oh wow, this really sheds a lot of light on what I read in the New Testament. This is really helpful in like my interpretive process. Which ones would you pick? And did you translate them?
Well, I did translate a few. So when I say translate, I take a lot of translations that already exist and I update them. For example, when I did Enoch, First Enoch, I love First Enoch, but it's the best manuscripts we have are in Ethiopian language. I don't speak Ethiopian. I don't write Ethiopian. I can't do that. So I do consult the works of other people who know it, but then I rely on Greek and I rely on English and I rely on other translators' work, and they just polish it off and improve it and make it better, essentially. But by having perused so much Hebrew literature as well, I'm able to see through all of that of what Enoch might have said if he actually said it in Hebrew. Let's put it that way. So yeah, a lot of my work is sort of suggestive, creative, definitely, adaptive, perhaps. But that's what I'm doing because my personal goal in retranslating some of these works that exist. I mean, look, anybody can right now go into a search engine of their choice and type Enoch, and stuff will pop up. And you can read a public domain version of Enoch that was translated in 1800s pretty much within seconds. It's easy. It's simple. It's there. Will you understand it or not? That's a different story because language has changed since 1800. So some of people who have training in literature and are used to reading old stuff probably would be fine. But majority of the people will get some of the archaic language and they'll say, what in the world is that? I mean, it's like asking people to read 1611 Bible or something like that. King James. And like, how many people would say, I don't read this because I have no idea what it says. And so to me, those are obstacles. They're obstacles to knowledge. They're obstacle to comprehension. They're obstacle to appreciate something that's beautiful. So I retranslated them. I smoothed out those texts. And so Enoch is the one I would recommend people read. If you want the more of an esoteric, visionary kind of storytelling experience about lore and legends and how things work. And it's a big imprint on a Jewish society because, look, most Jews did believe that the story that Enoch tells us about the angels conspiring and producing giants, that's a big part of Jewish lore. And Enoch is a reflection of that. And you will see that same idea, of course, in Jews who embrace the New Testament as well. So why not read that? That would be a good one to read. But
Nice.
But I would also say do not stop there. Read other things. For example, Letter of Aristeas. I've been working on a Letter of Aristeas. I haven't put it out, but I think I'm going to put out a Letter of Aristeas maybe sometime later this year on Kindle. Fascinating document. It tells you about how Septuagint was created. It tells you about how the books of the Torah were translated. That's where the legend of the translation of the 5 books of Moses really comes from. It's the primary source that we have for that. Other people who tell the same story, like Josephus, they just basically copy what Aristeas said and retell the story. But Aristeas is the original one. And so fascinating letter that really shows to you much more of a Hellenistic Jewish culture, an Egyptian Jewish culture, essentially, where Jews who live in Alexandria who are so entrenched in the Greek society and the stories that he's an Egyptian court of a king, Ptolemy, and he's going to tell you a story as a court official, pretending that he's not a Jew. But I don't believe that whoever wrote the Letter of Aristeas was not a non-Jew. I do believe he was a Jew because in my reading of the letter, I'm like, he knows too much. He knows too much. He understands way too much. He talks about these issues in a way more sophisticated way that as an outsider would. And so that's another look at a segment of Jewish culture. And people think like, what am I going to experience? Well, how about this? How about an explanation of kashrut from a way that you have never heard before? There's going to be like a chapter and a half, I think, maybe, or a big chunk of it, like that, where a high priest, Eliezer, is going to explain why Jews do not eat certain things. But he's going to explain it to a Hellenistic audience. And he's going to explain it in this very philosophical, moralistic kind of way. He's actually going to say, listen, the reason why we don't eat certain animals because of the way they are. And when you are what you eat. And so do you really want to be that? And so he's going to go down that road. And it's a fascinating way of explaining kashrut. Very non-rabbinic. But again, it comes from that era. It comes from that Hellenistic time when people explained the scriptures without having this thing standardized. And so you'll read a letter like that and it's like, okay, that makes sense. That's how people living in that place and that time understood the laws of kashrut. Perfectly rational, very philosophically, justifiable. Let's put it that way. And you can see the logic behind it. You say, okay, that works. Maybe these people are strange and quirky, but they got some good ideas. And that's why they are the way they are. So it certainly could be a little bit more apologetic, but that's another good letter, a good document to read, Letter of Aristeas. I did have, but if people want to sample something, I actually put together a little book. Let's see. Did put together a book.
Ooh.
It's called Unheard Voices.
Oh, there you go.
Of Hebrew Kings and Prophets. And what's inside here is a few shorter books like Prayer of Manasseh, the Book of Baruch, Psalms of Solomon, Testament of Moses, Lives of the Prophets, Apocalypse of Moses, and Apocalypse of Abraham. It's like a little sampler of Second Temple literature, essentially, that gives you these shorter works that you can digest very, very easily because, it's a thin book. So you just kind of read through them, and that gives you a taste, give you a sense what kinds of things that you will find in Second Temple literature. And so I go into each translation and I talk a little bit about the book and how it came to be and where it comes from and give people a little background information on it. And then I just let them do the text. And I don't do a lot of commentaries because I find that to be not constructive. People have all kinds of religious ideas, and I don't need to be putting my religious ideas necessarily into their head. So I want people to experience the text on their own terms. If I can help and be a little bit of a guide and help them decipher some of the things, that's really all I'm comfortable doing. I am reworking all three books of Enoch right now. I did work through all three of them, and so I'm polishing them all up right now, and I'm actually going to put out a study edition with footnotes on three books of Enoch. All three, they're very different. They're all completely not alike. They tell very different stories. The only thing that really binds them together is that they have this Enoch tradition. Okay. But besides that, they are all fascinating in their own standing. But I'm putting that together, and I'm just putting footnotes that are really not commentary, but more of explanations of terms and things that one would encounter in literature that may sound confusing, or connecting the dots. It could be geographical things. It could be etymological things, because there's a lot of wordplay that happens there and things like that. So I'm working on that, and that's going to be a fun project. And the reason why I do these things is because I want people to experience the text for what it is and make their own decisions. It's kind of my approach, not to try to sort of say be theological, but rather like, I will tell you what I know, and you decide what you're going to do with it. Because I think people are smart, and wherever they live, whatever their community that they belong to, they're going to have to try to reconcile it within their context. I can't possibly predict their context. I can't possibly even know their context. And so for me to speak into their context, it's too much. It's too big. I don't want that responsibility. Yeah. It's
a good point. All right. Well, I think that's probably all the questions we have time for. Do you want to give our listeners a way to follow you online? Are you on social media or?
Sure. You can always find me on YouTube, obviously, Pinchas Shir. You can find that. Or the easiest way to follow me, actually, the easiest way to stay in touch with me is pshir.com. It's that simple.
pshir.com.
P as in Peter, as in Pinchas, and then my last name, shir.com. Very, very short URL.
It's a good one.
It's a weekly publication that I run online. So it's just a digital e-zine where I publish all kinds of content. I'm not even say it's not a blog. I do a lot of video. I do a lot of audio, and some articles, but a lot of video. So I found that that's how a lot of people like to learn these days.
Well, it's been a joy to have you on. We wish you all the best in your ministry at Tikva David and your teaching ministry, and we hope to hear more, see more of your publications. The book is Unheard Voices, and we'll look forward to that compilation of Enoch. But thanks for joining us here on the podcast today.
Thank you, Jacob.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Jesus, check out First Fruits of Zion at ffoz.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who support our mission and get loads of exclusive Bible commentary, teaching, and content. You can join today at ffoz.org. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let his love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.